recording for today. All right. So today we are continuing through the Baroque era. And I want to get in and actually listen to a little bit of music today. So we're going to kind of talk about some of the characteristics of Baroque music and what all's going on in the Baroque era, the way that composers wrote the music, and then we'll get into actually listening to some of this music today, a couple of great Baroque pieces today that I want to get to. So if you want to have the multiple choice assignments up, I think today will mostly be on the second multiple choice assignment, which is the one that's due on Friday. And then also, if you want to pull up the listening assignment, the first listening assignment, we're going to go through two of those pieces today. And I'll probably answer all the questions for those listening assignments for those two pieces today. And then we'll finish it up on Friday. Okay. Remember that you've got 3 assignments due on Friday. And then the other 3 assignments for this section are due next Friday, along with the exam on next Friday. Don't forget about those performance assessments. You'll want to be working on those throughout the semester. And if you've got an easier week this week, if things are a little bit laid back for you, then it's a good idea to go ahead and knock those out when you have some free time. All right. Remember, they're a big chunk. Each of them is 10% of your final grade. So if you can knock those out, then you might as well do it. And if you've forgotten what those are all about since the first week of class, there is a folder in Blackboard labeled performance assessments, and it's got all the instructions and including an instruction video there for you to check out. Okay. Okay. Looks like Callista joined us. Let me get you marked as present here, Callista. While I'm doing that, so we are in the Baroque era, which occurs from 1600 to 1750 or so. Okay. Okay, somebody asked about the daily listening assignments, questions 3 and 4. Let me pull that up real quick. So question 3, this is arrangement of what type of work? This was originally written for opera, which is what that means. So it was originally an opera, and it was arranged for orchestra. That's what the orchestral suite version of this means. Okay, and then the piece is made up of many small parts called what? Those are movements, which is something that comes in the Baroque era. We start breaking apart our larger instrumental works into smaller groups, smaller pieces called movements, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit today as we get into some of these works. Okay. Okay, no problem, Calista. I got you marked as present, so you're good. Okay, so we were talking about the Baroque era a little bit on Monday, kind of a quick introduction to it. We started talking about some of the characteristics of Baroque music. I think this is where we left off on Monday. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So texturally in the Baroque era, music is primarily polyphonic. As I think I mentioned that on Monday as well, and we're going to talk about some ways that they wrote polyphonic music today with the fugue, which is one kind of the height of polyphonic composition. We'll get into that a little bit today. We talked about the organ and the harpsichord being the main keyboard instruments of the time. And I do want to take a minute to talk about the basso continuo, because this is an important part of Baroque music. So the Baroque orchestra evolves during this time, and so it's mostly string instruments, and the center of that, the nucleus of the Baroque orchestra, is called the basso continuo. And this is typically made up of at least 2 instruments. So the basso continuo is a bass voice, in this case usually a cello, sometimes a bassoon would make up the bass voice as well, and then a keyboard instrument, usually a harpsichord or some other instrument that plays chords like a lute. In the piece that we listened to yesterday, the Telemann Concerto, there was a lute playing the part of the basso continuo part. In the Brandenburg Concerto that we're going to listen to today, the harpsichord is covering a lot of that basso continuo stuff. And I want to explain how the basso continuo works. So in the basso continuo, you have a bass line, which is provides kind of the harmonic foundation of the instrumental music of this time. And then you have chords that are played over the top of that. So we have this bass and chord part with the melody over the top of it. So that's a form of homophony, of homophonic music. And what's interesting about the basso continuo is that the way that it was written was kind of a shorthand for composers. It was similar to what we see with jazz fake books today, where it just showed a bass line and then it had some numbers underneath that. And I can show you what that looked like. I've got an example of it pulled up. I had an example of it pulled up and it's gone away. Let me find it real quick. I know exactly where it was. So here we go. So that would look like this, where you would have just one single line written, you would have a bass line, and then you would have these numbers underneath. And those numbers tell the keyboardist or the lute player what chords they're supposed to play over the top. Okay, so I'm going to sit down at the piano and actually I'm going to do what we call realizing the figured bass, which means we take what's written and we figure out the chords that are supposed to go over the top. So the bass line itself would sound like this. So kind of a cool G minor bass line. And those numbers tell us what chords we're supposed to play over the top of it. And I'm not going to dive into all the music theory around it, but basically for the first chord, since there's a 6 underneath it, I know that I'm building a first inversion chord, which is going to sound like this. So it's a G minor chord with a B flat underneath it. For the second note, I'm going to go to this chord. All right? And then for the last one, it's got a G with no numbers on it, which means that I'm just going to build a triad based on the note G with all of those with the notes within the scale. All right, so if I go in thirds, I have G, skip the A, B flat, skip the C, and D. So I would build a chord with G, B flat, and D on it. Okay? And then I get to the D with the 6/4, which is going to sound like this. I had to pick how I was going to play that. Or no, it'll sound like that. Sorry. And then we have this 5 with the sharp 3 there, which tells me that I'm going to sharp the third note, which gives us this, that D major chord, so that we can get back to our G minor chord. All right, so if I put all of this together using my theory knowledge and my terrible piano skills, it sounds something like this. So a good keyboardist during this time would be able to sight read that part and be able to play those chords very quickly on the fly, and it would be much more than just the 5 measures or so that I have written there. So there'd be a whole lot of stuff going on, and they're constantly reading that line. It was a skill that was expected of the basso continuo players during this time. Also, you may have noticed that we end with a major chord, even though it's in G minor. So our tonic is that. And we have at the end G minor, D major, and then we end with the G major chord. That's called a Picardy third. It was very common in the Baroque era. You wanted to end with a major chord, even if the piece was in minor. They didn't like ending with minor chords. I disagree with. I love a good minor ending, but that's just the emo kid in me coming out, I think. Okay, so that's the basso continuo. Text painting or word painting continues during the Baroque period. It's actually a very important part of Baroque music. We talked about the doctrine of the affections and how the music would always express a mood of some kind. So composers were very big on the text and using the text to influence the mood. If it's a sad and dramatic text, then the piece is going to be very sad and dramatic, which seems obvious to us now in the 21st century, but that was a fairly new thing in the 17th century. All right, we talked about the Baroque orchestra a little bit, so I'm not going to get too much into that. Understand, though, that when we talk about the Baroque orchestra, this is not a big, full orchestra like you're used to seeing. This is a small group of instruments, so you might have 10 players to 15 players total, with the string players making up the bulk of the orchestra, a couple of violins, a couple of violas, a cello, sometimes a bass viol in there. And then you would have the basso continuo, so you might have a harpsichord or a lute of some kind. And then sometimes they would throw in other instruments like a flute or a trumpet or something like that, depending on what they were going for. So it was still kind of developing this idea of the orchestra. And the classical era is when we're really going to solidify what the string orchestra is and then start adding other instruments to it from there. One of the things in the Baroque era, composers started writing for specific instruments. There were a few composers at the end of the Renaissance that were doing this. Gabrieli was one of them. But in the Baroque era, it became very common for composers to start specifying what instruments were supposed to play what part. This is written for violins and trumpets, and I want these particular people playing these particular parts. That was much more common in the Baroque era than it had been before. We have some forms in the Baroque era that are common. One of the big things that we do, as we mentioned earlier, is we start breaking these bigger pieces into what we call movements. So if you remember back in the Renaissance, we talked about the Mass and how the Mass was broken into 5 parts. We take that idea with instrumental music and start writing, taking smaller individual parts and putting them together as one large piece. So a multi-movement work is made up of smaller parts. Each movement kind of sounds standalone, and you can listen to just one movement of a piece of music and it sounds pretty good, but then you put the whole thing together and it makes one whole piece with some kind of unifying theme or key or something running through it. And as we get further along and start developing the symphony in the classical and romantic era, we'll see that those movements become more connected than they even were in the classical era, or in the Baroque era, I mean. Okay? The movements are often contrasting with each other, different moods, different dynamic levels, different time signatures, things like that. We've got some basic kind of theory forms here, the ternary or 3-part form, which is ABA. And what that means is that the piece is made up of 3 different sections. You have a first section, the A section, and then you have a contrasting B section, and then we're going to go back and repeat that first section again. Okay, and then the binary forms basically mean that it's a 2-part piece. You have one section, and then you have a contrasting section from there. We're not going to dig too much into those theory forms in this class. So the chapter marked Music in Baroque Society in the book basically is telling us how music works in the world of the Baroque era. So most music in the Baroque era is written to order. These are what we could call commercial pieces. They're pieces that composers are commissioned to write specifically for certain events or certain people. So like we had in the Renaissance, we have the courts where most of the musical most of the music outside of the church is happening and is being developed. So the aristocracy have these courts where they live in these massive houses, and they have servants, and they have all these different people that work for the court and do different things for them. If you're familiar with the show Downton Abbey, that's a court. That was a court that lasted all the way into the 20th century. Same basic idea. And part of those servants is not just cooks and maids, but they would also have musicians that were part of the staff. They didn't have radios. So if you wanted to listen to music, you couldn't just plug in an iPod, or your phone and put on your headphones and listen to music. You had to have live musicians there to play the music for you. So these courts would actually hire musicians to do that. And some of the larger courts, emperors and dukes and all the most important people in a country would have these instrumental ensembles of up to 80 people, these very large orchestras or groups of musicians that would perform in different ways throughout the day, throughout the week, at these in these courts, including some opera singers. You had in Italy, especially when opera becomes popular in the Baroque era, which we'll talk about on Friday, you have the development of these private opera companies. So the courts are actually paying these musicians to put on operas specifically for them, for their own entertainment. We do have a couple of public opera houses that show up during this time, but those are pretty few and far between, and that's mostly in Italy, where the opera is extremely popular. So within these courts, you have all of the musicians, and then you have to have somebody that's kind of the leader of that. So we have our court music director, who is kind of in charge, and that court music director gig is the gig to have if you're a musician in the Baroque era. It's a well-paying gig. It comes with a lot of status. You get to live in these castles. Yes, you're technically a servant, but you're treated very well. You're paid very well. You're highly respected, and you get to attend a lot of the social stuff that the other court members attend. So you're directing the music, you're putting on the music. A lot of times the court music director is writing the music. Most of the time it's composers that have these court music director positions. Sometimes you have, if the court music director is not a composer, they'll actually hire composers to be a court composer as well. But most of the time the music director was doing that. And it was also their job to teach lessons to the members of the aristocracy, the members of the noble houses that wanted to learn how to play music. Still at this time, being able to play music was seen as a status symbol. It was a part of being well educated. So a lot of the dukes and duchesses and their children learned how to play music. So the court music director had the job of teaching these people. If you can imagine how incredible that would be. I mean, that would basically be like today if your job was to be the governor's personal music teacher. I mean, that's a pretty sweet gig to have. And in these courts, again, it was very, you had a lot of status and you were well respected. So a lot of times, these court music directors and the, maybe the princess of the court would end up falling in love and getting married. That happened a lot. In fact, some of the times, if you go back and actually look at it, sometimes by today's standards, it's a little bit creepy. You have a 30-year-old court music director who falls in love with a 15-year-old princess he's teaching music lessons to, and they end up getting married when she's 16 or something like that. That was a pretty common practice during this time. That's kind of the darker side of European history that we don't talk about too often, but it definitely happened. Even some of the most pious composers like J.S. Bach, who is known for being a very religious man, the dude had like 6 wives, and basically like every time one of his wives got older than 20, he would divorce her and remarry. So one of those things. I keep threatening my wife so my wife is 8 years younger than I am, so I keep telling her that whenever she turns 30, I'm going to divorce her and find a new one. She doesn't think that's funny though. Exactly. Okay. So. Yeah, the church music was still around during this time. It was very elaborate. There was a lot of instruments happening in church music at this time. And we'll talk about J.S. Bach and all the crazy stuff that he did. But one of the big things I want to talk about here is that to be a musician, to be a professional musician, you actually went through an apprenticeship. It wasn't like today. So today, if you want to be a professional musician, now outside of the 1 in a million shot of becoming a major pop star, right, which is mostly relying on either luck, being in the right place at the right time, or having some kind of connection. If you want to become a professional musician, you have to go to school for it. If I want to be the full trombone player for the New York Philharmonic, who is Joe Alessi at the moment, I would have to become a really great trombone player, practice my butt off in high school, go to a really good music college, get really good at trombone in college, go to one of the major schools for a master's and doctorate like Juilliard or Eastman or someplace like that, or the New England Conservatory, and then audition for the piece, for the spot in that orchestra. And that's where most of the professional musicians are today. The composers that are major, of course, the best way to make money in composition right now is to do TV and film composing. All of those guys go to school to do that. Okay. But most of the major composers out there live in LA, and a lot of them go to USC because they have a big film scoring program, and you end up a lot of them end up working with Hans Zimmer for a little while, or some of those major composers, and getting into the profession. In the Baroque era, though, it was seen as a skilled trade, just like doing something like being a plumber or being a welder is today, where you would actually you would work as an apprentice to a professional musician and learn the skills that way. And a lot of times it started from a very young age. If I wanted my daughter to become a professional pianist, then I would actually hire her out as an apprentice, and she would go live with that professional musician and basically be their servant for a while. She would do their housework and stuff for them, while also doing some of the daily duties that the composer has to do. Like if a composer is writing a piece for orchestra, they write everything down on a score, and then somebody else has to take that and write out the individual parts on separate pieces of paper and give it to the musicians. And a lot of times it was the apprentice that would do that. So they're getting to study the composer's work and see what they're really doing. And they're also taking lessons and learning the skills and networking at the same time. And then eventually they become a professional musician in their own right. So that was how music careers happened in the Baroque era. Okay. So let's get to some music. The Concerto Grosso and Ritornello form. The Concerto Grosso is one of the first instrumental forms of music that I want to talk about. By the way, the correct term for this is genre. We don't use that term in this class because you guys know the word genre as actually an incorrect usage. So we tend to think of genre today as the style, right? When I say what are some genres of music, you might say rock and roll, hip hop, country. That's not technically correct. Those are not technically genres, those are styles. Genres are actually have more to do with the form of the music and the instrumentation of the music. So a string quartet is a genre, a symphony is a genre, a concerto grosso is a genre, but that's just my soapbox. So the concerto grosso is a form of writing that composers use a lot in the Baroque era. And this is kind of a predecessor to the classical concerto and the classical symphony. They both develop out of this idea of the concerto grosso. So the concerto grosso basically means that a concerto is a piece of music that features a musician. Grosso means multiple. So concerto grosso is going to feature a group of musicians, usually 3, right? So the piece that we're going to listen to in just a second features the violin, the flute, and the harpsichord as the solo instruments. And then you have an orchestra that's backing them up. And again, that orchestra would vary a little bit depending on what the composer wanted. Okay, these are multi-movement works. Most concerti grossi from the Baroque era are 3-movement pieces, and they start as with a fast movement, and then they move to a contrasting slow movement, which is also usually a little bit quieter, and then they have another fast, upbeat piece to close out. And that last one is usually, or is sometimes, very dance-like in nature to close the piece out. Now, this form is extremely important. It is a test question, all right, but it's also going to show up over and over and over again in music history. So memorize this now. The concerto grosso is fast, slow, fast when we're looking at the three movements. Fast, slow, fast. When we get to symphonies and classical concertos, they're going to follow that same pattern, and if you already know it, it'll help you a little bit. Okay. The ritornello form is a popular form that's also used in the Baroque era, and this is a kind of form that's actually the way we organize the music together. So within a concerto grosso, they're going to use the ritornello form most often in the first and last movements. And this basically means that you have a main theme, which is played by the full orchestra, what we call the tutti section, T-U-T-T-I, the full orchestra, the large group of musicians. And then that's going to contrast with the solo parts. So we'll hear the full orchestra do some stuff, and then we'll hear the solo parts do some stuff. And then we'll go back and hear the full orchestra, and they're going to use this main theme. And that's that ritornello idea. You don't need to worry too much about that, though. So the piece we're going to listen to, and this is where you might want to pull up that, not Bach's Little Fugue, we'll get there. We're going to listen to the Brandenburg Concerto, which is the first piece on your listening assignments. So if you've got that open up, you'll get some of the answers here. So this is a piece written by J.S. Bach, one of the two big composers of the Baroque era. And this is Brandenburg Concerto number 5 in D major. So a little bit of history with the Brandenburg Concertos. So Bach was working for one particular noble family. He was a court music director. And in the late 17 teens, early 1720s, and he knew that his time there was coming to an end. So he started looking around for other work. Excuse me. And he had met earlier a guy who is the Margrave of Brandenburg, Germany, which is basically a title, some kind of city official. And he was, and that Margrave had a court. He was in charge of a court at Brandenburg. And Bach wanted to basically go and work and be a court composer for that Margrave. So he wrote him a letter, which is actually in your textbook. It's got some pieces of that letter, very like over the top, lavish. Oh, great Margrave, you're so wise and wonderful. I would love to. I mean, it's very much like a cover letter for a resume that you would send to a company. And then as part of the resume, he included these pieces. These concertos that he wrote to show off that he could write music for a court. He was primarily known at this time as a church composer, and he wanted to prove that he could write court music. He could write these concertos, these concerti. It turned out that Margrave didn't care. He wasn't interested in hiring him at all, so they never got performed. It wasn't until the like 1860s or 1870s that somebody discovered these pieces and started performing them. But now they're some of the most famous of Bach's pieces. They're some of his most celebrated works. So there's a bunch of them. I think there's 6 Brandenburg concertos. They're all made up of different orchestras featuring different instruments. This one in particular was written, as I said, around 1721. We're going to listen to the first movement, which is an allegro. It is the fast movement, one of the fast movements. And the solo instruments are flute, violin, and harpsichord. Now, it's actually pretty rare for the harpsichord to be one of the solo instruments. The theory here is that the court that he was working for at the time had actually just purchased a brand new state-of-the-art harpsichord, and Bach wanted to show that off. And he was an organist and a harpsichord player, so he actually wrote this part to be able to show off his own virtuosity on the harpsichord within this piece. So there's actually a huge harpsichord solo section at the end of this movement that really shows off that harpsichord playing. I'll show you a little bit of a clip there for it. So this is shown, it shows off the performers here. All right, so let's listen to a little bit of Bach's concerto, Brandenburg Concerto number 5. And again, this is a Baroque orchestra. So they're going to be performing on original instruments. You'll actually hear a real harpsichord in this one. Yes. The Baroque style flute, notice that it's all wood. So remember I talked about Baroque music filling up the space. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's very, very busy. That the harpsichord really never stops moving through the entire piece. And I do want to kind of fast forward to the end where the harpsichord kind of has a big solo section here at the end. So you can hear the harpsichord going nuts there, right? It sounds like a shredding guitar. Can you hear the harpsichord flying over the thing? Typical German performer. He's going nuts on the thing and he's just stone faced while he's doing it. It's insane. Right. So the Bach was a virtuosic performer. He was the Eddie Van Halen of his day, and playing stuff like that was shocking. It was like hearing the shredding guitar players that you hear today. Okay, I want to talk about the fugue here to finish class up. So the fugue is a very important polyphonic compositional form that comes around during the Baroque era, and this is really the peak of Baroque music. Fugues can be vocal or instrumental, and the idea is that you have a subject or a main theme that's going to be presented by itself initially. And then eventually the other voices are going to come in and imitate that main theme. So the one that we're going to listen to is going to start with this main theme. And then we'll hear other voices join in with that main theme. All right. Then we have what is called the answer, which is kind of a secondary theme that joins in as well. All right. And a couple of other terms that go along with fugues. There's a term called pedal point, which is a single note, usually in the bass, that's going to be held while the other voices are going on top. And they called it pedal point because most of the time it would be played by the pedals of an organ, which are the super low notes that you play with your feet. So you might have just, while the other voices are going and moving over the top of it, it's holding this one note. Okay, and then we also have an idea called stretto, which basically is where a subject is imitated before it actually finishes the full line. So it's like the second voice interrupts the original voice and goes on with the new theme, or repeats that subject before they actually get a chance to finish it. Okay, and we're going to listen to Bach's Little Fugue in G minor, which is one of the most famous fugues, written in 1709, originally for organ. And this is polyphonic in texture using the fugue form. Starts with that main theme, the subject that I played, and then the counter subject comes in. The original soprano voice takes over the counter subject when the alto comes in on the subject. Okay, and we're actually going to watch this YouTube illustration of it. I like this because you actually can see the different lines happening. It's animated. And you can kind of follow the melody here. So I'm going to turn off the lights so those of you in the classroom can see it a little bit better. So each voice has its own color. So as you're watching it, see if you can kind of follow the animation for each voice and figure out what that main subject looks like and follow it throughout the tune. I'm going to turn the volume down just a little bit because this is organ. Now you will notice towards the middle of this that this is a highly polyphonic piece, and this is one of those pieces that gets so complex with the polyphony that it's almost difficult to listen to. There's so much going on that it's very dissonant. So here is Bach's Little Fugue in G minor. Real quick while that's loading, so Kazi asked, what does BWV mean? That is a catalog number. So the BWV, it's a big long German word. It's like Bach-Werke something or else. That is how we catalog Bach's music. So when you see that number, it basically tells you when in the succession of his life it was written. So just calling it, Symphony Number 1 doesn't do us a lot of good because he may have written 50 concertos before that. So if we look at BWV, whatever, what is the BWV for this piece? 578 means that this is the 578th piece in the catalog of Bach's music. Okay, you can just tell us if is it fast or slow or something like that. And I believe the listening outline in the textbook gives you the tempo. So here's our subject. And then the orange. Remember, by the way, that this is being played by one person on an organ. pedal point where it's just holding one long note. Here comes the subject again in purple. But it's a major version of the subject. And there it is in pink. So I love the comments that I'm getting on online are hilarious. Somebody said, when I said, remember this is being played by one person on an organ, somebody said that's not possible. You can actually look up videos of people playing it. Understand that the purple line is being played by their feet. Okay, it's being played on pedals by their feet. So all of those melodic lines, it's really cool to watch real masters of the organ perform these kind of pieces. All right. That's what I got for you today. That took us right up to the end of the period. We will start there on Friday. Stay dry. Have a good rest of your Wednesday.
I didn't give a composition of both of those. What of the first and the second?
What is the what's the question exactly?
Just give me an example of what kind of composition.
What kind of composition? So like the first one is a concerto grosso, and then that one is a fugue. So that's the type of composition that it is. Rick Beato's videos are amazing. They're really good. You guys are hilarious. The form, it is a fugue.
Hey, Mike.
All right, any other questions from online folks?